Alright, thank you for joining me again. Today we're going to be finishing up our entire animation here. We're going to be building this countdown in Fusion, and then I'm going to show you how to wrap up everything and make this transition between the two. Alright, with that, let's get started. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and grab a Fusion composition. Now I need to figure out how long it needs to be, so I'm going to drag in my reference here, and I'm going to put it on here. I'm going to look for around where it transitions, maybe where it starts the countdown between the two. And actually, I'm probably just going to lengthen this out and make it about 10 seconds, so 300 frames. After I do that, I'm going to go ahead and go into Fusion. Now, as we go through it, you can see there's lots going on. There's text, there's animation, there's flicker, there's all these different things. Let's go ahead and just start with the background image here, these little brackets. To do that, it's pretty easy. I'm going to go ahead and grab this rectangle, and then I'm going to go ahead and grab a background. And what the background does is basically just adds color to it. So I can use the rectangle, plug it into the mask input of the background, and I have a square. I'm going to go ahead and uncheck solid, and then I'm going to go ahead and turn up the border width. I can merge this over my reference just so I can see what it looks like. And actually my reference looks a little small, so I'm just going to use a transform and increase the size of that. And then I'll use a transform later and shrink everything down to match the reference. But for now, I don't want to mess with the sizing, so I'm going to bring my reference up to match. I'm going to go ahead and move that rectangle till it matches pretty good, change the border width if I need to. And then I'm going to mess with these two parameters here, position and length. Length is basically how long it's going to be, and position is where that line is going to be along that rectangle. So I'll just move those around a little bit until I get a nice looking line that matches. And then what I can do with that is I can hit Control Shift and I can look for a mirror. Then just plug into this mirror node. Make sure that the rectangle is going into the yellow input of the mirror, not this blue mask input. The mask is going to be everything, and that's going to go into the background. So the only mask part should be into the background. Everything else should be in a yellow or green input. So then I can go ahead and put on this mirror. The first mirror is doing exactly what I want. And I can turn on mirror 2, and then I can move it around 90 degrees, and it'll mirror both of those. So I don't need a second mirror node. I can just use one to do this. And then I can adjust that offset to get it looking right. So now we need to add some text. So I'm going to grab a text plus node, and then I'm just going to plug that in so we merge it together. Now I just need to find a text that matches that I like. And then I just can resize everything here. I can move around my line spacing, my tracking. Tracking is going to be between the letters, or numbers in this case, and just make some fine-tune adjustments till I get a look that I like. Now to help me stay organized, I'm just going to create some space, and then I'm going to go ahead and add in what's called an underlay. This is just something that I can put underneath all the nodes, and so I know what they are and group together. I can hit F2, and I'm going to rename it something like center text. Put that underneath my nodes, and then if I or somebody else opens this up, they know what those nodes are doing. Now as we scrub through this, you can see that the text changes like 3 times. There's a few different ways we can do it. The easiest way is to have our text, add in a keyframe over here in the corner, and then we can change the text, add in another keyframe, so on and so forth, and then I'll just change at those points. Another way we can do it is by using dissolves, which are basically a switch that go from one thing to another. So you can see if I add in a dissolve, and I can merge both those in, now I can go from 0 to 1, which is going to just switch between these two texts that I have. And I can just add in keyframes to when I want those to switch, and I'll just go between those. So we're going to use this a lot for changing between our different components. You can do it any way you want. I'm just going to stick with the switches for now. Go ahead and rename them if you need to. Let's go ahead and create some more space. All right, as we scrub through, we can see that there is a second pattern here. There's this kind of crosshairs. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's go ahead and duplicate what we have here so we don't have to redo everything. I can move that original rectangle to the new location. I can go ahead and change that offset on the mirror and change the length. And then I can get it looking the way that this one does, without a whole lot of work and without having to redo all the nodes. I don't need any of that text, so I can go ahead and just disconnect it. Now you can see when we go through it, there's a flash for a single frame of some text there. So let's go ahead and just make some new text. So for this, I made an instance of the rectangle and mirror because I couldn't get the mirror to work right the way I wanted it to. So I'm just going to have this second set switch between my text and that side there. We have that blip where the text comes in, and I'm going to use a dissolve to switch between the two. And really the only thing you need to change on the instance mirror is just go in there, right click, and de-instance the second mirror, and then you can turn that off. If we don't de-instance it and I turn it off, it'll turn off on the other one as well. I don't want that, so just de-instance that, turn it off, and then we'll use a dissolve to switch between our text and that side. Now I just need to add my text to make sure I rotate it. I'm going to duplicate it and make the second text for below it, and I'll just use a merge to combine those two. And then I'll just find the point where these flash, and then I'm going to add in a keyframe on that dissolve to basically make it go from 0 to 1 and then back to 0. Now if I merge those together and bring it up in the viewer, you can see everything kind of playing out, how it's switching between the two. I got a new dissolve here that I can switch between basically my main text and this crosshair text with the little blip in it. So something I didn't go over, and let me go over quickly here, is sometimes you can set repeating patterns for things. So we have our main text, then it goes to these kind of crosshairs and the little blip there. We can set repeating patterns for that. Once we have keyframes in there, say set keyframes for like 2 positions, I can go to my spline editor, I can highlight that, and then I can click on this little set loop. What it's going to do is it's just going to repeat that pattern of keyframes continuously. So this pattern between the text and this little flash here, it's going to keep going again and again and again. It doesn't really work for this because the timing of the IMAX counter is off. It's not set to 30 frames. It's like 32 frames. It's a really odd number. I'm showing you this here because I did a lot of the looping before I realized that it's not actually going to work for this particular reference. But just to say that you can do that if you want it. Okay, so next, speaking of blips, there's this circle, and it's really big and then gets small again. So I'm going to go ahead and add in an ellipse, and of course a background to that. Go ahead and plug in that ellipse, and then we can go ahead and just dial this in a little bit. If I drag over on the edge diagonally, I can resize both the height and width, so it doesn't turn into an oval. But an easier way is to right-click, add an expression on one of these, and then go ahead and grab the plus and drag it to the other. So in this case, I'm going to drag my width down to my height. Now the width and height are going to move together. Every time I change the height, the width will change with it. So I'm just going to get my circle lined up. I'm going to add in a keyframe, and then I'm going to make the circle larger, basically to the bounds of where I need it to be. And then I'm just going to shrink it back down to the original. So an easy way to do that is just put a keyframe at the start, go 2 frames over, click on the keyframe again, and then change the center position. That way you only have to type in 1 number instead of 2. And again, I could make that repeating pattern, but it's not going to end up working for this because there's not really a set pattern for the way that the reference works. So I'm just going to skip ahead to the next part. I'm going to add in that next switch so I can switch between our text and this little blip here. Nothing new here. I'm going to go ahead and put in a keyframe to switch between the two. So we have some switching between our little crosshair text. We have it switching between that and our main text. And now we have our blip switching between that and all the text. And here it is playing on screen. You can see that it's working pretty well. It's looking pretty nice. And that's more or less all we need to do for that. I'm not going to add in all the little details on the side. If you want to, you can. It's not going to be any different than what we've done. You can go ahead and add in little details if you wanted to. But this is the majority of it, so I'm going to leave it there. Let's go ahead and move on to the counter, which is the real cool part of this. So first things first, I'm going to need a text and I'm going to need a background. I'm going to put in the text and I'm going to plug it in as a mask to a background just so I can change the color. If you've noticed, the color actually changes from white to blue over the course of this. And we'll do a main background once we get to the end of that and we can get rid of a lot of these other backgrounds. But I have my text and now I need it to actually count down. For that, we're going to use some expressions. So here's my main expression at the top there. It looks kind of complex, but let's just break it down. First thing we have here is we have comp render end, and really that's just the number of frames that we have in this whole thing. It's 300, so 0 to 299 in particular on this one. Next we have time, and that's just our frames. That's going to be frame 1, frame 2, frame 3. It's just going to be our current frame, so that's going to change over time. We have this giant thing called comp get preferences, blah, blah, blah. You don't really need to know that. All that is just saying, what's my frame rate for this project? In this case, it's 30. And then finally, we have ceiling, which is to round numbers up. So let me just plug in some of these and show you what's going on. So if I start with my frame range, the comp render end, minus my time, I get a countdown. It's going to go from 299 and it's going to minus a frame every frame after that. So I get a countdown. And that's good because that's what we want. But it's huge. It's not in the range we want. So I need to add in my next part, which is to divide by my frame rate. And now you see that we actually have some good numbers here, but it's a huge decimal number. That's where we add in the ceiling here, which will round the numbers up. So once I add that in, you can see that it works correctly. Now this equation down at the bottom is a correction for it. You can see that doesn't match up with our reference here. I'm going to add in +5 at the end of this to change it from 4 to 9, which is what it's supposed to be. And then over on my time, I'm just going to shift it a couple frames because it's not lined up with my countdown correctly. Again, the IMAX counter does not do it in seconds. It does it in weird frame rate. So I have it here. It's not going to work like completely across the board, but here's how you would make adjustments if you need to make them. All right, so now I need to make the rest of it. I'm going to go ahead and plug in a ellipse, as you might have guessed, but I can just merge it in. I don't actually need that background. The background is there if I need to change a color, but if I just merge it in and put it in the foreground, that green input, it'll work just as well. By default, it's a white color, so it'll work just fine for this. And at the end of this, we're going to take all of this and just use it as a big old mask anyway into a background, so don't worry about it here. This is another way that you can do it. I'm going to add in a second ellipse once I get that. Again, uncheck solid and turn up that border width. Link height and width together so it's easier to resize them. I'm going ahead and copy and paste that ellipse and just make a smaller version of it. Don't worry about the blue mask input. That's just how masks add together, so that's fine. Now I'm going to make that vertical and horizontal line. I'm just going to add in a rectangle for that. I'm going to make it really thin, make it really tall. Just keep it on solid. And then all I need to do for that is duplicate that one. And then I'm just going to switch the width and height on that. So now we have most of the main components that we need for this counter here. Now the main one is this little hand that goes around as it counts down. Now, I went through a lot of different versions of this, like making a radar, changing to polar coordinates. It's actually much simpler than that. So let's go ahead and make some room. I'm going to go ahead and grab an ellipse, put it into a background. We're going to use the ellipse to do this. So to do this, we're going to go ahead and put in the ellipse, uncheck solid, and just crank up that border width. Now, if I turn the width and height down, you can see I actually have a circle here. And what I can do, since it's not a solid, is I have these position and length controls again, like we did with the rectangle. Now, if I move that length, now we have a wipe. Now it's rounded and it's not straight. All I have to go over here is go to the cap style and change it to a flat edge. And now we have that cool wipe. Again, if this was every 30 seconds, I could just make it go from 0 to 1 and then immediately back down to 0 and then 0 to 1 and create a pattern for that. Okay, so now I'm just going to pause it here and explain it. Some of my recorded material got corrupted when making this. All I'm going to do here, instead of having the circle, you're thinking it's not a circle, we have this wipe hand. I'm just using a transform to make it bigger, so it's outside of the frame. And now you can see over here on the left hand side that it looks correct. Now we need to make an extra edge on that border to swipe around, and that's pretty easy. All I'm going to use is an erode dilate. So I'm going to go ahead and grab that transform. I'm going to plug it into the erode, and I'm going to crank up the width. And this is just going to add a little bit of width to our wipe here. And then I just need to merge it back over top. And then if I change that merge to exclusive OR, it cuts out the top of that. What's going on here is I have our wipe, I'm making it a little bit bigger, and then I'm cutting out the original from that. So all that's left is that edge. And then I'm going to take that edge, I'm going to go ahead and merge it in over top with our background there, because I want to use the background below that to control the opacity of our wipe. So I'm putting it there so it's not affected, but below, if I change the blend here to like 0.5, it changes the opacity of the wipe below it, but it keeps it solid for that hand above it. Okay, so we're really, really close. There's only one thing left, and that is this little blip here does an inversion of the number. You can see it goes from a blue number. Now we have that blip there. Now it's black. So I'm going to go ahead and grab our counter here, and I'm going to move it over to the side. Let's go ahead and plug in a switch to switch from our text to our counter here. Eventually we go from all our text over to this countdown. So that's all I'm going to do there. And then over on my blip, all I'm going to do is I'm going to create an instance of that text. Again, Control-Shift-V will create an instance. And all I'm going to do is create a switch to go from my normal blip that I had over on my text side of it over to this one that has the number cut out. And this merge is set to stencil. So anything going in that green input is going to become a cutout in whatever I have below. So I'm just cutting that number out of that circle and then switching between the two once we get over to the countdown. All right, now that we have all that made, we can go ahead and start with our effects. There are a few things here that we can do. You can see there's a little bit of a scroll going on. There's some blur, there's some squeezing of the image here. I'm not going to go into a ton of detail here. I have another video I did on this, making retro effects, but I'm just going to go over a few of what we can do. So the first thing we can do is we can just throw on a blur. Pretty easy, throw on a blur node, and we can keyframe that, make the focus go in and out. If I want to add in some grain on top of this, I can go ahead and just use a fast noise and go ahead and turn up the detail. I can go ahead and turn up the scale so it gets really fine details there. If I want to add in some motion, I just increase the seethe rate a little bit, maybe like 3. And then we have some motion there. I can just merge that over top of everything, and we have our grain. Now I did forget to do the ellipse around all the text here, so I can just merge that in real quick. If I want to add some shake to this, it's actually pretty easy. We just use a transform to move it around and go ahead and right click on my X and Y value there, and I can modify with a perturb. Now if I go over to my modifiers tab, I can go ahead and turn up the speed. Make sure I turn down the strength and wobble a lot. I don't want it to move real far, I just want it to move fast. So go with like 0.1, 0.1, and 10, and that should work pretty well for a shake. I can go ahead and add in a rectangle mask over top of everything. I can just merge it in and go ahead and set that merge to mask. That'll kind of cut off the edges like we have here in our reference footage. Then I'm going to go ahead and do what we said we were going to do at the beginning, and I'm going to shrink down the whole composition. So I can go ahead and grab that transform and just shrink it down to size to match my reference. So the next thing I want to attack is the film scroll here. Before I do that, let me rearrange things, clean it up a little bit. Now to make the film scroll, it's really easy. All you need to do is add in a transform. Then we can go ahead and change the canvas type to wrap. And now you can see as I move the Y, it just keeps scrolling endlessly. So I can go keyframe it from like 0.5 to 1.5, and that should do the trick. And then of course, lastly, let's do this squish here. All I'm going to do is add another transform, and this too I'm going to change to wrap, and then I'm just going to do it on the X-axis. Now I can uncheck this use size and aspect so I can move the X and Y individually. Then I can go ahead and squish the X-axis. And if I want, I can get fancy and put in an expression. I can put in sine. Sine wave goes from -1 to 1. I can divide that by 2 to go to -0.5 to 0.5. Add in 0.5 to move it from 0 to 1 so that X will cycle between 0 and 1 over time. And I can keep tweaking that to make it less if I want, but now I've got this film scroll and I got this squish in and out. And at this point, you're just doing it to taste to whatever you want to use. Again, I would check out that video for my retro effects. I got more in there like scratches and other things that you might want to put on this, but I think this is good enough for now. All right, so I'm going to go back to my edit page. I'm going to go ahead and put in a new timeline. I'm going to go ahead and drag in my clip that we rendered out before. And then I can go ahead and I can just bring in my fusion composition as well. Now there's a couple ways to bring these in. One way is to just go ahead and grab the setting file and just drag it right into the fusion page on a new fusion clip. Of course, you're going to have to go back to the edit page and set the frame range correctly. Here I have it set to 300 frames. I have a note in there. You can make it longer, but then you're going to have to adjust settings in it to make it work correctly. The other way is to, again, drag in a fusion clip and go up to import, and then you can import fusion composition. You won't have that option unless you're in the fusion page. And here you can see I have a couple different versions. I have one that's the whole thing that we just did. That's more like our IMAX reference. And then I have one that with the text and the counter actually split up, depending on what you want to use. The two that I have split are more aligned to 30 FPS using that spline editor trick that I showed you earlier. So to make this transition, I first need to align my clips to make that transition look as smooth as possible. I can find a good place where that 8 is, where it transfers from one to the other, kind of making the timing the same. And now I'm going to duplicate both of those clips. I can highlight one, and then I can hold Alt to make a copy and hold Shift and drag up. Shift will just keep it from moving side to side. And I can trim them down. Let's go ahead and trim it to maybe from the 10, and then maybe trim it to about 3 seconds. 3 seconds should be good enough to make this transition. So now I need to change both of these to a compound clip. If I don't do that, the timing is going to be off because I've just changed the range of my fusion composition. But if I change it to a compound clip first, it'll just act like a normal clip. Now one is going to be shorter than the other because we don't have the range on that. That's okay. What we can do is we can go to the front of this clip. I can go over here to speed change and I can create a freeze frame. And then I can just drag it out. I don't really need motion in my top clip because I'm going to go ahead and fade that off right into our moving clip below it. But once I got both those, I can highlight them and I can go ahead and right click and make it a new fusion composition. Now I can just go over to my fusion page and I'll have both clips in there. So go ahead and sort them out. I want my counter to be the background and I want our blender render, that is fun to say, I want that to be our foreground. I'm going to go ahead and first put on a transform. And I'm going to go ahead and resize this and move it to till it about matches. I can go ahead and go on that merge and turn down the opacity so I can see what I'm looking at. And then I'm going to get them roughly aligned. And I'm going to go ahead and keyframe that. And then I'm going to go a few frames further. And then I'm going to go ahead and reset those. So it's going to shrink and it's going to grow like we're pushing into it. And we're going to cover that up with a few flashes. So let's go ahead and add in that brightness contrast like we've done before. Go ahead and set it to 2. So that we have our color looking right. And then I can go ahead and start stacking on effects. The first one's going to be light rays. Light rays is pretty nice. It makes these glowing rays come out of your object here based on brightness. I'm going to go ahead and just crank up the brightness all the way. That's all I'm going to do with that one. Then I'm going to set in a second one, and this one's just going to be rays. With that one, I'm actually going to turn the threshold down. And then I'm going to put on a third effect, and that's going to be highlight. And for highlight, I might just turn the length down, maybe like 0.182. So these are the settings I used previously to make that transition. I was having a little trouble getting going this time. The trick to this was actually go to the brightness contrast and just turn down that gamma. And what we're going to do is we're just going to control that brightness with the gamma there. Make sure that you have clip black and clip white on. I'll show you what happens. If you don't have it on, you can have these unnatural colors when you go over 1 in white or below 0 in black. So make sure those are on so that we have our nice color range there. So then we can just keyframe it to be really small at the beginning and then turn up that gamma to make our transition. And then the other thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to grab the end of this clip here and I'm going to go ahead and just fade it. Then it's just going to do the white blast, and that's going to fade onto our render there. And that's all you need. Now we're finished. Now you know how to make the whole thing in Blender, how to composite it in Fusion, and to make all the transition-y things here. Thank you for watching. Go ahead and do some dabbling of your own, and we'll see you around.